In this presentation, we'll take a look at the Phillips curve, which will show the relationship between inflation and unemployment. Now, the Phillips curve is going to be a partner graph of the ADAS graph because it's going to show a lot of the same information in a simplified version that aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph will show. To look at what this trade-off between inflation and unemployment is, let's look at some of the data over the years. Now, what we can see over the years is that there, in general, is an inverse relationship between unemployment and inflation. And so you can see that it's almost a mirror image of each other when we look at the data over the past 20 some odd years. And just like our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, because they are partner graphs, it's an easy way to think of them, we're going to have a short run and a long run Phillips curve. Now again, a couple of things we can point out about the graph already. We can see how we label our axes. We have inflation and then unemployment down across the bottom. And what we see is we have a downward sloping curve. Our short run Phillips curve is a downward sloping line because again there's an inverse relationship between inflation and unemployment. And so what we see is when the economy is overheating, right, or we're in an inflationary gap, we're overproducing, there's going to be really low unemployment but high inflation. And so that would be represented by a point like this. Now on the converse, if there's a recessionary gap, then what we would see is very high unemployment and low inflation. Again, this is generally speaking, this is what we would see. And that would be represented by a point down there on the Phillips curve. So that's what would happen to cause shifts along the Phillips curve. Now, those were both examples when aggregate demand would shift. What we're going to look at now is what happens if aggregate supply were to fall or to decrease, leading to our scenario of stagflation. It's when unemployment is high and inflation increases. And so what we notice is because our graph is an inverse relationship, it's impossible to move along the curve and move into a position where stagflation could be represented. So the way that we would achieve that is by shifting our curve. Again, notice how it would be impossible to show high unemployment and high inflation without shifting our curve. So in this case, when aggregate supply falls, or when it would shift to the left, our short run Phillips curve would shift to the right. So now let's introduce the long run. And again, think about what the long run aggregate supply curve represents. That it represents full employment, that it shows what our potential output is. And so now that we're looking at the Phillips curve and unemployment is one of is what we label our bottom axis, then again we're still going to be able to represent full employment on our Phillips curve graph. So let's look at what happens when aggregate demand increases. Right? So when our aggregate demand increases, we see GDP go up. It puts us into an inflationary gap. And what that's going to cause is inflation to increase because price level would go up and unemployment would go down. And so we've shown that by shifting along the curve to the left. Now the question is what happens in the long run? We made the same type of movement on our ADAS graph. We represented what would happen in the short run, and then we could also show what happens in the long run. So let's see what happens in the long run. Now again, in the long run we know that the difference is that wages or resource cost will go up or down with the change in price level. So because our price level increased when our aggregate demand increased, and we represented that by showing a movement up along the curve, right? Then we know our wages will have to increase. So in the long run, our aggregate supply would decrease, right? Now again, we showed you an example on a previous slide that if aggregate supply falls, the only way we can represent that on our Phillips curve is to shift our Phillips curve. And so if aggregate supply falls, what we see is price level goes up and unemployment goes up. And so we would see a shift to the right of our Phillips curve as our aggregate supply curve shifts to the left. Now what we can also show here is where our long run Phillips curve would be. Because again, if we're shifting to the long run on our aggregate supply curve, what we're doing is we're shifting back to our long run aggregate supply. And so if we're showing the short run versus the long run on our Phillips curve, we would have to show or represent the same thing, to represent where our full employment would be. And so we would add a vertical long run Phillips curve. What we see is in the long run, there really is no trade-off between inflation and unemployment. Again, we're showing the exact same thing that we've shown on our ADAS graph. On our ADAS graph, our long-run aggregate supply represents a point where unemployment's not going to change, where we're at our potential GDP, we're at full employment, and the only thing that would change at that point is price level or inflation. Well, we're showing the exact same thing here with our long-run Phillips curve. At our long-run Phillips curve, our unemployment's not going to change. We know our GDP's not going to change because unemployment is often connected to changes in GDP. And so the only thing that would change is our rate of inflation. Our LRPC is yet another way that we can show full employment in an economy. So we can show it on a business cycle, we can show it on a PPC, we can show it on our ADAS graph. We can also represent that on our Phillips curve. So again, let's go through another example of short run versus long run with our long run already in place. All right, so we're showing an economy that's at 3% inflation, 5% as our full employment, because again, our point is we're looking at that equilibrium point between our short run Phillips curve and our long run Phillips curve that represents full employment. So what happens when aggregate demand falls? Right? And so what we're going to see, when aggregate demand falls, that unemployment will increase. When aggregate demand shifts to the left, that puts us into a recessionary gap. It means the economy has gotten slower or smaller. It means unemployment has gone up. And in this example, with aggregate demand falling, our inflation has dropped, our price level has dropped. So again, now let's transition to the long run, because in the long run we always want to be at our LRAS, or in this case our LRPC, our long run Phillips curve, because we always want the economy to be at full employment if possible. So in the long run, in this scenario, real wages would fall. Because our price level dropped, therefore we assume wages could drop, cost of resources would fall, and that would allow us to shift our aggregate supply to the right. So our aggregate supply would increase, and that would shift us back on our Phillips curve, back to long run Phillips curve. Now again, we've been talking about what happens on our ADAS graph because that's where we would get the information to show on our Phillips curve. So I wanted to show you a few examples with both graphs side by side to see if we could pick up any trends that may help you as you're working with the Phillips curve. So here's an example of one side by side, and we'll talk about this in class, but one of the things that I would always recommend is to draw these graphs side by side, just like this, even with the equilibrium points on each graph, where your starting point, so to say, at the same level. The reason is because there is an easy way to kind of self-check yourself after you've completed your LRAS and your ADAS graph and your Phillips curve graph. Now again, make sure you've got them all labeled correctly, and let's see what happens when aggregate demand increases. So when we're on our aggregate demand, aggregate supply graph, we know that an aggregate demand increase would shift that curve to the right. So we've shown this shift on our graph. Now also look what happens on our Phillips curve. When our aggregate demand shifted to the right, price level increased, quantity increased, or output increased. And so now we need to show that on our Phillips curve. So we know inflation has gone up, and we know unemployment has gone down. So that would shift us on our Phillips curve up the curve to the left, but we're still moving along the curve. Now let's see what happens when we start in a recessionary gap. All right, so again, we're looking at the same thing. Recessionary gap, our aggregate demand, aggregate supply will intersect to the left of our long run aggregate supply. So again, we need to show that same starting point on our Phillips curve. So what we want to show is, because we're in a recessionary gap, we know unemployment is high. So to start in a recessionary gap, we would start with a point along the curve that's to the right of our long run Phillips curve. If aggregate demand were to fall, then we would see a shift that looks like that, where aggregate demand shifts to the left. Right? Now look at what happens to the corresponding point on our Phillips curve. On our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, our point shifted to the left. Because it was an aggregate demand shift, we simply move along our Phillips curve. And so when our aggregate demand shifts to the left, we're going to move along the Phillips curve to the right. Show you a couple other examples before we wrap up. Again, wanted to show you the same thing, but this time looking at an aggregate supply shift, because you'll hopefully start to see kind of the pattern that exists. So again, we're starting at full employment, so we'd want to start our point on our Phillips curve at full employment. We're looking for an aggregate supply decrease, so we'll shift aggregate supply to the left. So we see what's happened to price level. We see inflation's gone up, and we see output has decreased, which means unemployment has increased. So again, to show that on our Phillips curve, we're going to have to shift the curve. So what you can start to see, and what we've shown in the past couple of examples, that if there's an aggregate demand shift on your ADAS graph, then you will simply move along the curve on your Phillips curve. If there is an aggregate supply shift like we've just shown, then your Phillips curve will actually shift. The other thing that we can start to point out here, and you can look at the previous examples but also what's on the screen right now, is notice how it's a mirror image of each other. When I said the reason why I would always draw these graphs side by side is because there's an easy way to self-check the work that you've done. This is it. So whatever changes you've shown on your ADAS graph, you should have a mirror image of those changes on your Phillips curve. So it's a nice easy way to kind of double check to make sure that you've done the same thing, or you're showing the same thing on each graph. Right, we'll show you one other one. We went through an aggregate demand increase, an aggregate demand decrease, an aggregate supply decrease. So let's show you one where aggregate supply would increase. In this one, we're starting in a recessionary gap. So again, we'd want to start with our point to the right of our long run Phillips curve, just like we would start with our intersection point to the left of our ADAS. We want aggregate supply to increase or shift to the right. So we've shown that on our graph on the left. Again, to show what's happened on our Phillips curve. Again, aggregate supply shift, we're going to have to shift our Phillips curve. So we'll go ahead and do that. And notice when you draw them side by side, another thing that you can see is when we shifted our aggregate demand, aggregate supply, we shifted it back to full employment. So we're going to have to do the same thing on our Phillips curve to make sure we shift that point back to where our short run Phillips curve intersects our long run Phillips curve. So again, that way both of these new equilibrium points would represent full employment. That is all that we've got for this video. Until next time.